Relatives, in-laws, outlaws. Yeah. Okay, well, we have a lot to talk about, so let's talk about relatives. Let's start off with relatives. What's interesting about relatives is, you look at the whole Bible, the whole Torah, 1/5, the whole of Genesis basically, all it seems to be talking about is human relationships in close-knit families, relatives. Adam and Eve have 2 sons. Cain and Abel, what happens? One brother kills the other. I mean, what a way to start off the world. Imagine, God just created a world, and just straight away it starts off with a murder, a fratricide. Brother kills brother. It's terrible.
Can I interrupt you, please?
Yes.
And do you count Lilith, L-I-L-I? Okay. It's a magazine.
I know, it's a magazine. But, I mean, we're going according to the Bible. The Bible does not mention that word.
Okay.
It's not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. It's more midrash. But let's go back to the point. The point is, what is the Bible telling us in terms of the creation of the world? And that is human relations. God didn't create human relationships. God created human beings. And we have to aspire to build our relationships to the best that we can. And if we don't do that, we don't work on it, then we're bound to fail. So it's something which we have to work on and improve and try and get the best of the relationships. And we're talking about human relationships. And this is true in any human relationship. A person can build a bond with someone, or a person can destroy the relationship. So it's really up to our choices. God gave us free choice. We have to utilize the free choice. What happened in the situation with Cain and Abel was the emotions got in the way. Cain gets very jealous and gets very angry and very upset with his brother. Why? Because whatever he does, it seems his brother is copying him. He brings a sacrifice to God, his little brother comes along and brings another sacrifice. An even better one-upmanship. So he gets very mad. But obviously there's other factors as well. There was a lot of jealousy behind the scenes. So the Bible's telling us right at the beginning, it says relatives, there's a lot of jealousy. And where there's love, there's always hate. If there's no love, there's no hate. Where there's love, there's always hate. Where there's jealousy, you can bet that there's a lot of emotional attachment or emotions involved. If someone doesn't know anyone, he doesn't know the other party, obviously there's no emotions involved. It's only when you get to know someone, that's when the emotions kick in. So it's when you get to know someone, you're studying their culture, whatever it is, then the emotion start having a role. And where do we go next? We go to the story of Noah. Noah has 3 sons. What happens with the 3 sons? One of the sons, Noah curses. Imagine a father cursing his sons. He curses his 3rd son, Ham. And the Bible is not very explicit what happened over there, but it says that Ham saw his father's nakedness. It was something to do with their relationship, which is very strange, and it's going on. And the Midrashim again talk about it. But we see over there relationships again. The Bible is pointing out human relationships and human failures. The 3rd case we find is Abraham. Abraham has 2 sons, Ishmael and Yitzchak. What does he do with Ishmael? He gives him the boot. His wife Sarah says, send him away, send away Ishmael. So Abraham has to throw out his son. Ishmael is thrown out. Then we find the case of Jacob and Esau. Again, Jacob and Esau seem to be jealous of each other. Jacob buys the birthright from his brother Esau for a bowl of soup, and Esau hates his brother, wants to kill him. And you find this tragic scenario going right through the first book of Genesis and culminating eventually in the hatred of the brothers for Joseph. Joseph and his brothers, the story of Joseph and his brothers. So what is the Torah teaching us? And the answer is the Torah is teaching us in this first book. The first book, I think, is the book where the Bible is teaching us about human relationships. That's what the whole book is all about. Basically, if you read the book of Genesis, it's about creation of human beings. And one of the questions we have today is, the Bible is 3,300 years old. What relevance does the Torah have to us today? And the answer is, human nature, from that time till now, has not changed. Machinery, technology may have changed. The truth is, human beings are human beings. We have the same emotions, same emotional makeup, same mental makeup. Nothing much has changed in that scenario, except for the fact that today people are more wide apart. They have more room to spread out. They have more places to go. So therefore, these frictions which occurred when people were tightly knit families, maybe today are not so well expressed, because people just run away. So the parents leave the house, and that's it, they say goodbye. They may call their parents, once every 6 weeks, if they're lucky. The siblings, they part and they don't call each other at all. So today there's more room to run. In those days, they were close-knit families, close-knit environments. Everyone knew each other. There was a very small society. So therefore, these feelings were magnified many times over. So the Bible is telling us is, God created a world, but really it's up to us what we do with our relationships. We have to get insights into the failures of people in the Torah. Because the Torah is just a book. It tells us the human relationships. It's telling us the first book is just human relationships. It's telling us the failures and successes, because we're going to talk about the successes. It's not just full of failures, there's also successes in human relationships. And we have to try and learn from this book and try and see in our relationships not to make the same errors and same mistakes in our relationships. So that's really what we have to learn from the first book. The first book tells us we have to learn from all these different human personalities, learn from their successes and learn from their failures. So instead of us going through the school of hard knocks and learning from our own experience, Paul says, don't learn from your own experiences. Don't go through it yourself. I'm giving you a list of experiences of others. Take their experiences and learn from it. Take their experiences and apply it to one's own life. I mean, that's what the whole first book is all about, is taking other people's experiences and their family relationships and learning from it and applying it to our own lives and not making the same mistakes that they made. Really, that's the crux of the whole book. So it's interesting. There's a saying in the Torah, Prophet Isaiah, and paraphrasing it, there's an English saying which is, blood is thicker than water. Where does that saying come from? It's a statement in Isaiah. If you want to look it up, it's Isaiah chapter 58, verse 7. And Isaiah over here is crying out to the people of Israel. This is towards the end of the first temple period. First temple period was around 2,600 years ago. Around 2,600 years ago. And he's telling them that what does God want from you? So as we know, we have fast day. Yom Kippur is a fast day. And so he tells them, he says, why do you fast? Why are you fasting? And he tells them, listen, you're fasting, and yet you extort all your debts. And you fast in order to strike each other with a wicked fist. So you're fasting for the wrong reasons. Why are you fasting? A fast is just a joke. What is the fast for? So he's telling them, what is the fast for? He says, surely this is the fast that I choose. Break open the shackles of wickedness, undo the bonds of injustice, let the oppressed go free, annul all perversions, break your bread for the hungry. The whole purpose of the fast is to feel what it's like to be hungry. Give the bread to the hungry. Bring the moaning poor to your home. When you see a naked person, clothe him. And do not hide from your own relatives. So here we have it. This is the bottom line, the punchline. Isaiah's punchline. Isaiah is complaining to the people. Here they are. They're keeping all the rituals. They're fasting. But you know what? They're not very nice people. They don't feed the poor. They don't clothe the naked. They don't look after their own relatives. What kind of society is that? So we go through the motions. You can fast in Yom Kippur, but the other side of the coin is human relationships. So Isaiah is telling the people, you keep all the rituals, but what about the human relationships? God doesn't want you to fast. God wants you to fast in a different way. Do good, do righteousness. So that's a very important point. And Isaiah throws in this, don't hide from your own kin. Don't hide from your own relatives. What does that mean? What applications does that have in terms of Jewish law? So Jewish law has legislations like no other religion. We have legislations on every little topic, how you wear your shoes in the morning. What side should a person sleep on? The rabbis talked about everything. Nothing is left to the imagination. You got to wear your left shoe first, then your right shoe, tie your left shoe first. Sorry, you wear your right shoe first, then left shoe, you tie your left shoe first, then you tie the right shoe. What's going on over here? Every little thing is legislated. How much more so Judaism has legislations when it comes to relatives. Where do we find the legislations when it comes to relatives? So number one, we know there's a mitzvah in the Torah, the fifth commandment, which is honoring one's parents. We know there's a mitzvah to honor one's parents. What about brotherly love? And here the Bible tells us, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha." You will love your friend as yourself, which today is mistranslated as neighbor. The Bible doesn't say neighbor, it says love your friend as yourself. Rambam says if he does actions of a friend, then you have a mitzvah to love him. If he doesn't do the actions of a friend, there's no mitzvah to love your enemy. That's not Judaism. That's a different religion. There's a mitzvah to love your friend. A person does the actions of a friend, you have to love them. You have to give back what you get. It's very important. and not to do to others what you don't want others to do to you. That's a negative. But what that includes, obviously, one's own relatives. Loving one's friend as oneself. Hopefully the relatives are friends. And that would include the relatives as well. But Judaism does not leave it at that. Just say, you know what? Love your relatives. How do we apply that in our daily lives? It's a practical religion, not just theory. There's a mitzvah to love God. How do you apply that? So you have to pray to God. There's many different things you have to do, a person has to do. There's many rituals between man and God to show one's love of God. It's not just I love God. Judaism says love human beings. How do you love human beings? Judaism doesn't just leave it at that. It says, tells you how. So the Code of Jewish Law tells us in the laws of loving kindness. There are laws of loving kindness in the Code of Jewish Law. And usually we talk about it in terms of charity. Loving kindness, today we think about in terms of giving money. But the truth is, it's more than giving money. It's visiting the sick. It's clothing the naked. It's helping someone who needs to move, picking up something, picking someone who can't move from the chair, helping them walk, cross the road. All these are acts of loving kindness. Charity is just a minor portion of it, just a small portion of it. But the truth is, acts of loving kindness come before charity. What a person does with their body is more important than what the person does with their money. Money is a low level. It's more important where a person spends their time. A person volunteers their time. It's a much higher act of kindness. So here the Code of Jewish Law tells us, and it tells us an order of precedence in giving charity. What is the order of precedence? Who do you give to first? Obviously, we have limited budgets. Not everyone has a massive budget. We all have limited budgets. And the question is, what are the order of priorities in terms of our budget? How do we allocate resources? You know, this is a big question today in society and medicine today. How do you allocate your resources? There's limited resources in the medical budget. How do you allocate your resources? Who does it go to? So same thing, same issue applies to a person's own budget. Who do we allocate our resources to? So Code of Jewish Law says, the first thing is one's children who grow up. A person has to raise children. That's a mitzvah. Once they're grown up, you have no responsibilities. That becomes a different issue, the issue of charity. Charity begins at home. Charity begins at home as a Jewish law. That's the Code of Jewish Law says. So if the children cannot support themselves, the parents should support them in the laws of charity. Not in the laws of raising children, because they've grown up already. They're not considered children anymore. It's interesting, in Jewish law, when is a person considered an orphan and when is a person not considered an orphan? At what age does a person not become an orphan anymore? Exactly. When they're independent, when a person is independent, they're not considered orphans anymore. The Bible says that God hears the cries of orphans and widows, because in those days they were considered helpless. So when is an orphan considered an orphan to be helpless? When they can't support themselves. They're considered orphans. When they can support themselves, they're not considered orphans anymore. So the same thing, similarly, a child grows up, there's no mitzvah to raising them anymore. The person did their responsibilities. They put them through college. These kids now should be self-supporting, but they're having trouble finding a job. Parents can support them and have the mitzvah to support them through the laws of charity, and these children come first than anyone else. Plus, the Code of Jewish Law says, if a person has old elderly parents, like a lot of us have, elderly parents, there's a mitzvah on the child to support their parents. So the first priority in Code of Jewish Law is one's children and one's parents. Why? Blood is thicker than water. He learns this out from Isaiah. Don't hide oneself. Mibsarcha al titalem. Don't hide oneself from one's own flesh. And where do we see this in the Bible? The Bible tells us explicitly. The story of Abraham. Abraham is looking for a wife for his son, Yitzhak. And he has many choices in the Canaan where he's living right now. He tells his servant, go back to my father's house, to my relatives, and find me a wife for my son. So one of the commentaries says, the reason for that is, says again, if you're looking for a spouse, if you're looking to do kindness, which is an act of kindness in those days, he wouldn't ask for such a big dowry, he had a lot of money, he didn't want such a big dowry, he wanted to do kindness with his own relatives. Marry into the family. Today we don't advocate it so much because of health reasons. But in those days it was highly advocated this way. There's no question of outlaws. You have the same relatives. It's not, you don't get a new family to deal with. The Talmud advocates it, that a person should marry their aunt, their niece. It's not allowed for a Jew to marry his aunt. The Talmud says a man should marry his niece. Why? This way the in-laws are his own relatives. Therefore there's no problems, there's no more frictions. Today we don't advocate that. 1,000 years ago already, Jewish law says it's not good for the health. Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, who was a famous Ashkenazi rabbi in Germany, passed the laws saying a person should not marry their close relatives. So even first cousins is not advocated in Jewish law to marry first cousins or nieces because of the problem of genetic disorders in families. But at one time it's advocated. Why? Because it's much simpler. Life is much easier when you don't have new relatives to deal with. It's much easier to marry into the family this way. We're all related anyway. We know each other. So Abraham picks a wife for his son from his own relatives. This way, why? He's doing kindness with his own relatives. His own relatives won't have to pay a big dowry to get their daughters married. In those days, they had to pay a big dowry. Who's next? So first comes one's children, and then comes one's parents. Who's next? Other relatives. Other relatives. And the order priority of giving charity, other relatives are number 2. So that's the code of Jewish law. There's an Ashkenazi commentary on the code of Jewish law. The code of Jewish law is written by a Sephardic rabbi. His name is Rabbi Joseph Caro. He was thrown out of Spain in 1492, and he eventually ended up in Tzfat in Israel. And over there he became the chief rabbi of Tzfat, and he wrote the code of Jewish law. At the same time, there was an Ashkenazi rabbi in Krakow, in Poland, writing also his own code of Jewish law. But when he heard that Rabbi Joseph Caro already wrote a code of Jewish law, he says, okay, I'm going to cancel my plans of writing a code of Jewish law. I'm going to write a commentary on his code of Jewish law. His name is Rabbi Moshe Isserlis. And there's tremendous respect between these two rabbis. They wrote letters backwards and forwards. It probably took 3 months for the letters to get. There's tremendous respect between these two rabbis. And because of that, Sephardim and Ashkenazim only have one code of Jewish law. So we have is a code of Jewish law and a commentary in the same book, in the same volume. So Ramah gives a slightly different order of priorities. What is the order of priorities? Number 1, he says, oneself. A person is closely related. The closest relative we have is ourselves. Who comes first? We come first. Where do we see this? The Bible says, love your friend as yourself. Whereas a person doesn't love themselves, how can they love others? We have to look after ourselves. And that's very important. As a parent, the parent has a responsibility, extra responsibility to look after themselves. Because a parent who's not looked after cannot look after their children. It's very, very important. So a person's got to look after themselves. That's number 1 priority. So therefore, charity begins at home, literally. A person can't afford to give. If they do give, they're going to be taking from other places. So the first case is take it yourself and don't take from others. Help yourself first. That's number 1. Number 2 is, he says, one's poor parents. Number 3, one's children. Number 4, one's siblings. And then come other people. So there's an order of priority in terms of charity. So we see that what? Relatives do count. Blood is thicker than water. In Jewish law, blood is thicker than water. And in fact, we see this also in the laws of mourning. Well, the laws of Avilut, a person loses a relative. There are 7 relatives which are pointed out by Torah law that a person has to mourn for. Who are these 7 relatives? Father, mother, sister, brother, son, daughter, and spouse. 7 relatives. And it's interesting because there are 2 levels of mourning. There's a mourning period which lasts 30 days, and there's a mourning period which lasts 1 year. The only 2 relatives where a person mourns for a whole year are parents. That's it. So it's interesting. It seems siblings, the relatives' responsibilities are directly, mainly to their parents first. It's a 1 year period of mourning. A person can't go to parties, can't listen to music for a whole year. Other relatives, of the 7, it's 30 days. That's it. It's interesting. Parents get more mourning than children. It's a mitzvah from the Torah to honor one's parents. Yes? Yes, there is. We said it. Son, daughter. Yes. There are 7 relatives. Father, mother, sister, brother, son, daughter, and spouse. Son, daughter, and spouse. But a son, daughter is only 30 days. Father, mother is a year. So again, we see that in laws of mourning, certain relatives are specified only. No one else. The person doesn't have to mourn for anyone else. They have to mourn for their teacher. They lose a teacher who they learned from. It's like their parent. They lost a parent. But again, today we don't do that because we don't learn from any one individual. We learn from books. So today we don't have a single teacher. Even students in schools, every year they change their teachers. In those days they would have one teacher for 20 years, and whatever they knew, they would learn from one teacher. So basically that teacher was like a parent. Today we don't have that system. And therefore the law of honoring, of mourning for teachers doesn't really apply today. So that's a very important idea. The idea of relatives do come first. It's interesting. Jewish law states quite clearly that in certain cases, relatives do come first. The laws of kindness, acts of kindness, relatives do come first. And there's a beautiful story of the grandson of the Chavetz Chaim. Chavetz Chaim is a very great rabbi that lived in Poland, and his grandson ended up in Lakewood Yeshiva, just down the road, 40 minutes away, Lakewood. And he was a very, very dedicated student. All of a sudden, the head of the yeshiva notices that he starts coming late in the mornings. He says, "What's going on?" So he calls him aside and he asks him, he says, "Tell me, what's going on?" He said, "Rabbi," he says, "every day on my way to the yeshiva, I pass a woman who has 4 children, and she can't manage. Children are crying, the baby needs some food, they need the diapers, so I stop and I help her." So the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, is very impressed. He says, "Wow, yeah, tremendous mitzvah, you're doing an act of kindness." He said, "Who is this woman?" He said, "Rabbi, it's my wife." People forget that acts of kindness begin at home. And this is very important. The most important person in a person's life is one's spouse. And again, the Bible emphasizes this. It says right at the beginning, with the creation of Adam and Eve. It says, and therefore it says, a man should leave his father and mother and cling to his wife and be one flesh. That's a very important concept, that charity begins at home. And plus, who's one's most important relative is one's wife. A person's got to leave their parents and stick to their wife. The spouse is very important. So a person shouldn't let the in-laws and the outlaws get in the way. First, the person's got to focus on the other partner. It's very important. Focus on the partner. The parents can look after themselves for a while. And then when the bonds are cemented, then a person can go back to the parents. But first, the person's got to cement the bonds between the new couple. And that's very important. But I'll come back to in-laws. I haven't got to the in-laws yet. So the whole book of Genesis revolves around this concept of brotherly hatred. And then what happens? The book of Genesis ends with exile. The Jews end up in Egypt. How come they end up in Egypt? Because they sold their brother into exile, slavery. Now it's interesting because if you want to look at the Bible again, it doesn't really explicitly say that they sold their brother. It doesn't say that. It says the Midianites passed by, and then the Ishmaelites and the Midianites took him out. It doesn't say exactly who took him out from the... if you look at the whole story, it doesn't say exactly who took him out from the pit and sold him. It's very unclear at that point. The Rashbam, who was the grandson of Rashi, says the brothers didn't sell Joseph. If you look at the Bible, have a look at the whole passage again. It doesn't explicitly say that they sold him. But later on, they blame themselves, and he says, don't blame yourselves. So it seems like from the story later on, it seems like they sold him. There's a debate amongst the commentaries who sold him. But even if they didn't sell him, they put him in the pit to die. They were responsible for them ending up, whether directly or indirectly, in Egypt. The Bible, the first book, ends off with exile. Why was the exile caused? Brotherly hatred. The rabbis tell us, brotherly hatred causes exile. The reason why we're still in exile as Jews is because we don't get along with each other. The reason why the second temple was destroyed, the rabbis say, we have a fast day to commemorate that, is Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. It's a fast day, commemorate the destruction of the 2 temples. The second exile was caused because of brotherly hatred. So we see the book ends with this. This is the bottom line of the whole book. Brotherly hatred leads to exile. Don't do it. There's a warning at the end of the book. Just like we have on a pack of cigarettes, a government health warning. So at the end of the book of Genesis, there's a health warning. Hazard to your health. Brotherly hatred. Don't hate your relatives. Try and get along. And what happens? The book of Exodus starts off with brotherly love. Where? The cure to exile? Brotherly love. Where do we see that? Who loves each other? Miriam loves her brother Moses. Moshe Rabbeinu. Miriam and Moshe. The Midrash says Miriam caused Moses to be born because her parents separate. There's an interest in Jewish law. In times of persecution, why bring more children into the world? So, time of death, destruction, should a person have children, not have children? So her parents separate. Pharaoh decreed a law. All the firstborn males are going to be killed into the river. All the male children are going to be killed. So they separate from each other. Miriam says to her parents, you're worse than Pharaoh. Say, what? Say, yeah. Pharaoh decreed on the males, you're decreeing on the females as well. They're stopping having children completely. So they went back to each other and they had Moses. So Moses was born. And then what happens? She looks after him. He's in the river Nile in a little basket. I'm sure you watched the movie. You've got to read the book. The book is more important. You've got to read the book. The book, what happens? He's in the River Nile. Who's watching over him? His sister, Miriam. And I'm sure there's a lot of danger involved. Why? Because if the Egyptians found out this was a Jewish kid, and they saw this was a sister, and the law was the kid should be killed, they didn't follow the law. She could be put to death. So we see that she devoted herself to her brother. So that's love of a brother. So you see the whole difference between the whole book of Bereshit of Genesis is hatred between siblings. The book of Exodus starts off with love of siblings. What's the classic example? Moses sees a vision. God in a burning bush. Whatever that means. Obviously God can't limit himself. He saw a vision of God in a burning bush. And he argues with God for 7 days. Don't choose me, pick someone else. Why 7 days? Why do you argue so much? I mean, if God appeared to me, I'm sure I wouldn't argue. Wouldn't have the chutzpah to argue with God. I mean, you're going to need a lot of chutzpah to argue with God. So commentaries ask, what was his main point of contention? You know what his main point of contention was? Pick my brother, my older brother. This is not the way to do things. How can you pick the younger brother over the older brother? My older brother will get upset. I don't want to upset my older brother. So see how things change completely. From Bereshit, older brother, younger brother, no problem. I'm the younger brother. Joseph, I'm the younger brother. I'm going to rule over my brothers. Moses, the younger brother, sensitivity to his older sibling. No, I'm not going to rule over my older brother. Give it to my older brother. Give the responsibilities. Give the honor to my older brother. Until God tells him, the Midrash says, your older brother is going to come and greet you, and he's going to be happy. And he'll be a partner with you. Don't worry, he's going to be a partner with you, and he's going to be happy. He's not going to hate you for this. Then Moses agrees. Okay. And truth is, Aaron, no problem. Aaron is very happy. So we find, instead of the sibling rivalries of the book of Genesis, of Bereshit, Shemot, the next book of Exodus, starts off on a very good note. What does that lead to? That leads to redemption. The whole Bible is telling us an amazing thing. Sibling rivalry and hatred leads to murder and exile. Sibling love leads to redemption. That's a tremendous concept over here. And tremendous moral message. There's a tremendously moral message over here. Let's give some examples of brotherly love in the Bible. So we said Genesis is also a brotherly love. Where do we find it? Abraham's brother Haran dies. Just read about it at the end of last week's Torah portion, which deals with Noah and the flood. It ends off with Abraham and his brother. His brother Haran dies. What does he do? He marries his niece, Haran's daughter. Sarah was his niece, and he adopts his nephew as his son. So again, his brother's children are orphans. What does he do? He looks after them. He adopts them. He marries his brother's daughter, adopts his nephew. Abraham had 2 sons, Isaac, Yitzhak, and Ishmael. He throws Ishmael out. But the end of the story is, when Abraham dies, the Bible tells us, Ishmael and Yitzhak both come to bury him. Ishmael came back to his father. He didn't bear a grudge against his father. So we see there was a sort of meeting of the minds in the end of his lives. It's very important to know the end of the stories. The beginning of the story starts off with hatred, but the end of the story ends off with love. Yaakov and Esav, Jacob and Esav. They do make up at the end. In the end of the story, it says Esav kisses his brother Jacob, and they make up, and they live in peace and harmony later on. Joseph and his brothers finally do make up. I mean, it caused a lot of damage, but eventually in Egypt they do make up. So we find that with all the difficulties, we find the Bible is telling us there is a long road. Sometimes there's a lot of pain, sometimes a lot of hatred. Just make sure you get to the same destination as Joseph and his brothers got to. They came to some sort of agreement. Esau and Jacob came to some sort of agreement. Ishmael and Yitzhak came to some sort of agreement at the end. And that's the difference between the forefathers and the period before them. Period before them, brothers hate each other, they killed each other. Period after that, the forefathers, they didn't kill each other. They got very close. They came very close to it, but eventually they made up. So there is some kind of redemption in the story itself. That's something which we have to learn as well. When we feel these emotions, how to control them and how to harness them and how to get over them. And when we read these stories, we get some sort of impetus and some kind of idea of how to get over them. Whereas the book of Exodus starts off with brotherly love. Okay, let's talk a bit about in-laws and outlaws. Where do you find bad relationships, in-laws and outlaws? There are quite a few of them. We said before that Abraham adopted his nephew, Lot, as his son. He adopts his nephew. Everything works out for a while, until it says, the Bible tells us, their shepherds start to fight. It doesn't say that they started to fight, but it says their shepherds started to fight. And the reason seems to be the ethics involved in being a shepherd. So a shepherd would have flocks, and the flocks would wander around searching for food, and sometimes they would graze on other people's ground. So Abraham was ethical, and he claimed that this is robbery. Lot wasn't so ethical. He said, look, the land's going to belong to me eventually, because it's promised to Abraham, and therefore everything belongs to me now. And therefore I'm allowed to graze my sheep wherever I want. Abraham couldn't take that. He tells Lot, he says, you get first choice. Let's split apart. Let's not fight. Brothers shouldn't fight. Let's split. Fight. Obviously, it's better to be together and be in harmony. But the next best thing is, Abraham tells his brother-in-law, let's split and not fight. So we see over here that if in-laws cannot get along, the best remedy is part ways, and until there can be some sort of harmonious arrangement. That's the best solution, until there can be a harmonious arrangement. So Lot and Abraham separate their ways. They part ways, and Lot goes to Sodom, which is coming up in this week's Torah portion, and Abraham moves somewhere else, moves to Beersheba in the south. The next situation is Jacob and Lavan. Jacob and his father-in-law. Jacob marries Rachel and Leah, whose father is Lavan. What does Lavan mean? White. What does that mean? He was Mr. White. Lavan was Mr. White, which means he's the biggest con artist in the world. He was always Mr. White, but he was the blackest guy around. But even his name was a con. His name was Mr. White. But Jacob and his father-in-law always argued. What do they argue about? Money. The biggest fight between, seems to be, again, in-laws seem to be arguing about financial arrangements. In Lot's case, this was true in terms of the ethics of the situation of money. And in Abraham's case, in Jacob's case with his father-in-law, they were arguing about dowry, who is the wife, who is this, and then eventually they started arguing about money. You didn't pay me enough. And he says, yes, I did. And they argue backwards and forwards until eventually they part ways in very bad company. And Jacob runs away from Lavan. Lavan chases after him with an army and eventually catches up with him. And God warns Lavan, don't kill Jacob. Don't hurt him. But eventually we see that in Lavan's mind, can you imagine a father-in-law wanted to kill his son-in-law? I want to kill that guy, that son-in-law of mine. I'm going to kill him. So we do find hatred of in-laws, in-law hatred. But the story ends peacefully when God appears to Lavan and warns him not to touch Jacob. So what they do is part ways. Lavan decides he's going to live in Syria, and Jacob lives in Israel. And they promise they're not going to cross the border. No, they're not going to have any border wars. So that's the solution is, one of the solution is to part ways. Where else is there a bad relationship is David and Saul. King David killed Goliath. He wasn't a king yet. And Saul was the king at that time. Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, was the king at that time. And one of the things Saul said was, if a person could kill Goliath, I will give him my daughter to marry. His daughter's name was Michal, which Michelle probably comes from the word Michal. So give him my daughter to marry, and David kills Goliath, and Saul gives him his daughter to marry. So David becomes Saul's son-in-law. Saul's son-in-law eventually becomes a general of the Israeli army. And people start considering David as their savior, not Saul. Saul is the king, David is the general. People start composing songs, the Bible tells us. David is the main person, he killed so many people, he's defending us against the enemy. Saul hears about this and Saul gets jealous. And then Saul hears rumors that the prophet Samuel had anointed David as the next king. So Saul really gets upset and he wants to kill his son-in-law. So again we find tremendous jealousies, not just amongst siblings but now amongst in-laws. Tremendous jealousies amongst in-laws. So it seems like the closer people get, and this is true, and magnetism and everything, the closer people get, the more they interfere with each other. People who are far apart, they don't interfere with each other. We don't see each other, we're not going to worry about each other. But you have to work very closely with someone. You have to live very closely with someone. You're always coming across someone then either you get along or you don't get along. Either you attract each other or you don't attract each other. And the solution is try and live together in harmony, but otherwise the best solution is to keep apart. So David and Saul is another tragic situation of in-laws who become outlaws. And Saul literally tries to kill his son-in-law David, tries to get rid of him. And many times he hunts him, but David doesn't reciprocate. David doesn't hate Saul. But eventually David takes over. The son-in-law does become king. Saul dies in a war with the Philistines. Nothing much has changed. Then we can find some good relationships. Father-in-law, son-in-law. We find the story of Moses and his father-in-law. Who's Moses' father-in-law?
Jethro.
Very good. Very good. Yitro in Hebrew. Jethro was the father-in-law of Moses. And in fact, Moses respected his father-in-law so much, he named the Torah portion, which has the 10 Commandments in it. One of the biggest Torah portions, greatest Torah portions. What does he name that Torah portion? Yitro. Jethro, after his father-in-law. How did you put the 10 Commandments? Where would you put the 10 Commandments? How would you call the name of this Torah portion? Called after your father-in-law. What honor he gave his father-in-law. It says when his father-in-law came to meet him, he took all the elders and all the great people and went to greet his father-in-law. That was the respect he showed his father-in-law. And this is Jewish law. Let's find Jewish law. What does Jewish law say? As we said, Jewish law legislates everything. So what is the relationship meant to be between a person and their in-laws? What is the ideal situation? Legislate Jewish law. So there's a whole section, Code of Jewish Law, on, this is just one page, on honoring one's parents. Written there, he throws in a spanner. Honoring one's parents, okay, the Bible says, 5th commandment, honor your father and mother. And then it says later on, it says to respect one's father and mother. We talked about that last week. The dialectic between honor and respect. It shouldn't just be honor, but it should also be respect. And we said honor is support, providing for them, food, clothing, if they need it, that's honor. Respect is not arguing with one's parents. Much very today, forget about it. Not arguing with one's parents, not sitting in the place they normally sit, standing up when they walk in. All these laws of respect, which you don't find today. But there's laws about this in the Code of Jewish Law, respecting one's parents. And then he tells us, the Code of Jewish Law says, a person is obliged to respect their older sibling. Okay? The older sibling you have to respect. Why? Because there's an extra word in the Torah. The Torah says, honor your father, but in Hebrew it says, kaved et avicha ve'et imecha. It should have said, kaved et avicha ve'imecha. Why does it say ve'et imecha and your mother? It should say, honor your father and mother. It says, and, there's no word in English, there's a definite particle over there which is missing in the English. There's an extra word et over there, so the rabbis learn out the extra et to refer to one's older sibling. The person has to honor the older sibling as well. And whether it's a step-brother from the mother, or whether it's a step-brother from the father, it doesn't make a difference. If it's older, even one side, the person has to honor them. And then he continues, Chayav Adam lechabed chamiv. A person is obliged to honor their in-laws. This is the spanner, he throws the spanner in the works of honoring one's parents. He said a person is obliged to honor their in-laws as well. And it's probably the hardest thing to do. But it's also the best thing to do. It's the best thing to do. How does a person honor their in-laws? Where do we learn it from? We learn it from King David. We said his father-in-law hated him, but he never reciprocated. He always treated his father with respect. Where do we see this? So the Bible tells us he calls his father-in-law Avi, my father. From there we learn, now the commentaries tell us, always call your in-laws mom and dad. You have to call your in-laws mom and dad. Not just your parents, but also your in-laws mom and dad. This way you have to show them the same honor as you show your parents, and this way that minimizes the friction, hopefully. When they get that honor of mom and dad, hopefully that should be enough. They should leave you alone now. They should hopefully leave you alone and not be too overbearing. Now it's interesting, there's another law in Jewish law, which is a very interesting law. And that is in terms, before even the whole issue of child abuse. Jewish law mentions child abuse thousands of years ago. The Talmud already brings up the subject of child abuse. And it says the father should not hit his children over a certain age. What is that certain age? The certain age depends on the child, when they are going to retaliate. Makes sense, right? In other words, if you see the child looking at you like this, I'm going to get you one day, you know. Scripture says, stop. Don't do it. Why? Don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind. There's a biblical law. Don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind. What does that mean, don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind? This has very many applications. Number one, literally, there's a blind man walking down the street. You don't put something over there, trip him up. That's obvious. That's number one. Number two, someone comes to you for advice. Right? I go to my stockbroker for advice. I don't know what's going on in the market. He says, buy this share. And he trips me up. He's putting a stumbling block in front of the blind. And number three, someone who doesn't know any better, causing them to sin, is putting a stumbling block in front of the blind. So here the father is hitting his son, and the son can't help it. The son's going to retaliate. The rabbi said, stop. You're going to cause him to retaliate. You're going to cause him to trip. You're going to cause him to hit his own father. Don't do it to him. But this does not only apply to physical abuse. This also applies to verbal abuse. And this also applies to emotional abuse. This also applies to mental abuse. We have to know, parents have to know the limits in their relationship with their children. And this has to be learned. This is the wisdom of raising children. Parents have to know the limits in their relationship. How much can you demand from your kids? And the in-laws, also if they're wise, they've got to know this as well. There's a limit to how much you can expect. Because it's got to be wise. It's very important not to insist on one's rights all the time. This applies to any relationship, spousal relationship. Husband says, I want my breakfast, lay the table. What are you talking about? You can't demand rights. There's this thing as demanding rights. It's got to be done with love. You can't demand rights. You know, it's interesting, in Jewish law, there's a mitzvah of chesed, we mentioned before. There's a mitzvah of kindness. There's a mitzvah to go and visit the sick. How many times a day do you have to go and visit the sick? Anyone know? It's not legislated. Why not? You can't force someone to go and visit the sick. If I don't want to go and visit the sick and you're forcing me to go, what kind of impression am I going to make on the sick person? You can't force someone to do these things. You can't force someone, the parent can't force the child to honor him. The child's going to rebel. It's got to come with love. It's got to come through education. These relationships have got to be built up through respect and honor. But who starts these relationships? So it's interesting. You can't expect the younger generation to start the relationship. Why? They just don't have the maturity and the knowledge to do it. It's the older generation who have to initiate. So it's a very, very important point. The older generation have to initiate. The younger generation don't know how to do these things. They don't have the maturity. They don't know what's going on. And they have a tendency to get very emotional and very upset very quickly because they don't understand. So it's the job of the older generation to initiate, to create a relationship based on respect and honor, not say, you know what, the Code of Jewish Law says you have to honor me. And here it is, you have to honor me. But the person has to be worthy of honor. And that's really the wisdom involved in being an in-law, being a parent, is the wisdom involved of being the person who's entitled to honor and knowing how to be honorable. How to be honorable is very, very important. And so that we see the good relationship between Moses and Jethro, his father-in-law, how he respected him and honored him, and even put the 10 Commandments in his Torah portion. And he went out to greet him, and he gave him seats of honor. And where else do we see this? The story of Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. The Bible tells us. It's a book which we read on the festival of Shavuot. Who is Ruth and Naomi? Ruth and Naomi, the story takes place. Ruth was the great-grandmother of King David. She wasn't even Jewish. What happened was, one of the wealthiest people of Israel ran away from Israel in the time of a famine. He left his people, said, I don't want people lining up outside my door. He left them and ran away with his 2 sons. And he moves to a land called Moab, pagan land. His sons intermarry with the daughters of the land, Ruth and Orpah, his 2 daughter-in-laws. And then he and his 2 sons die, and his wife is left alone with her daughter-in-laws. But we see over there tremendous respect and love between them. Tremendous respect and love. And this love is so strong that one of the daughter-in-laws converts to Judaism and comes back with her to Israel. This is Ruth. If a person wants to know how to behave with one's in-laws, a person has to study this book of Ruth. the book of Ruth is really a paradigm. It's really an example for us of how to respect and honor our in-laws. But you can say over there that there's no problems over there. Why? Because all she had was her in-laws. She left her parents. She doesn't relate to her parents anymore, and therefore she just goes to in-laws. She respected her mother-in-law more than she respected her own mother, and she has a very close relationship with her mother-in-law, and she supports her mother-in-law. The mother-in-law's old. Mother-in-law's lost all her belongings. She goes and she actually works for her mother-in-law. She goes to support her mother-in-law. That's really the main classic example in biblical literature of honor and respect for in-laws, and that's the ideal. But really, the truth is, ideal is really Moses. Moses had his parents alive, and Moses is also honoring his other side of the family, his wife's side of the family, and that's important. That a person shows respect to their spouse by honoring their parents. It's like respecting one's spouse. I honor your parents, and then hopefully you reciprocate and honor my parents, and therefore both sides will be happy in that relationship. But again, the onus is on the older generation to initiate, because you can't expect the younger generation to have the wisdom and knowledge and experience to do this. So as the older generation have to be the role models. And the truth is, what goes around comes around. If we honor our in-laws, our children see this and they'll honor their in-laws. If we don't honor our in-laws, the children see this as well. They know how to behave with their in-laws. So everything, we're all role models. We have to realize parents are like on a stage in front of their children. A person's a parent, especially when the children are younger. The smaller the children are, the bigger the parents are. Because in the children's eyes, parents are always larger than life. Whatever we say is magnified 10 times. It's very hard to, if you can remember back when you were a child, watching your parents. It's like they're on a stage and you come home and everything. A little shout, the parent might not consider it much of a shout. The child's ears is magnified 10 times. Whatever a person sees is magnified when they're children, magnified. So children pay attention to little things. There's a story, one of the Russian, I think Tolstoy wrote the story, about a very wealthy individual who looked after his parents at home, but always gave his parents the worst. One day he comes home and he sees his son making a bowl out of wood and carving out a bowl. So he tells his son, "Oh, it's for your grandfather, right?" He said, "No, Daddy," he says, "when you get old, that's what I'm going to give you." So in other words, how we treat our parents, that's how the children are going to treat their parents. They're going to treat us. So what goes around comes around, and the same thing applies to the in-laws and the outlaws. Now it's interesting, in those days, the Code of Jewish Law says, in the laws of mourning, not only does one sit shiva for one's relatives, the 7 relatives mentioned, one should also sit shiva for one's in-laws. We don't do this today. It's interesting. This custom stopped about 300 years ago. But at one time it was considered honor to the spouse. So you see how spousal honor really has gone down. At one time, the honor to the spouse was so great that a person would honor their spouse by sitting shiva for the spouse's parents. The spouse's parents passed away, a person would honor their spouse by sitting shiva for the parents. So both parties probably became too hard. Both parties would take off work, no one would support the family. So therefore the rabbi said, okay, it's enough. It's a custom, you don't have to do it, it's too much for people to suffer. The whole family's in mourning. It's enough one person's in mourning, not the whole family. You're going to shut down the whole family for the whole week. But one time, that was the honor people gave each other, there was a mourning period for spouse, for in-laws. So that's what we see. So what the Bible tells us is, it starts off on a very bad note, but it ends off on a very good note. It starts off with all the problems. The book of Genesis starts off with all the problems. In direct relationships, in in-laws and outlaws, and then in the book of Exodus, everything improves. And we find that exile is related to bad relationships, and redemption is related to good relationships. So when Moses and Aaron and Miriam get along, there's redemption. When Moses gets along with his father-in-law, it leads to redemption, it leads to the 10 Commandments. And when they don't, things deteriorate very rapidly. We have to really make an effort. Every one of us has to make an effort. So there's 3 levels. Highest level is harmony. Second level is keep away. Third level is discord and fighting. So the 3 levels, and we have to try and get to the highest level, but if we can't, the second best level is just move somewhere else. Keep out of each other's lives, just don't fight. Main thing is not to fight. Whenever you see each other, have a good word to say about each other. Maybe absence makes the heart grow fonder. Okay, we'll stop here. Any questions? Anyone have any questions? Yes. Interesting topic tonight. Relatives, in-laws, outlaws.
Particularly outlaws.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have a lot to talk about, so let's talk about relatives. Let's start off with relatives. What's interesting about relatives is, you look at the whole Bible, the whole Torah, 1/5, the whole of Genesis basically, all it seems to be talking about is human relationships in close-knit families, relatives. Adam and Eve have 2 sons, Cain and Abel. What happens? One brother kills the other. I mean, what a way to start off the world. Imagine, God just created a world, and just straight away it starts off with a murder, a fratricide. Brother kills brother. It's terrible.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes.
Do you count Lilith, L-I-L-I? Okay. It's a magazine.
I know, it's a magazine. But, I mean, we're going according to the Bible. The Bible does not mention that word.
Okay.
It's not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. It's more midrash. But let's go back to the point. The point is, what is the Bible telling us in terms of the creation of the world? And that is human relations. God didn't create human relationships. God created human beings. And we have to aspire to build our relationships to the best that we can. And if we don't do that, we don't work on it, then we're bound to fail. So it's something which we have to work on and improve and try and get the best of the relationships. And we're talking about human relationships. And this is true in any human relationship. A person can build a bond with someone, or a person can destroy the relationship. So it's really up to our choices. God gave us free choice. We have to utilize the free choice. What happened in the situation with Cain and Abel was the emotions got in the way. Cain gets very jealous and get very angry and very upset with his brother. Why? Because whatever he does, it seems his brother is copying him. He brings a sacrifice to God, his little brother comes along and brings another sacrifice. An even better one-upmanship. So he gets very mad. But obviously there's other factors as well. There was a lot of jealousy behind the scenes. So the Bible's telling us right at the beginning, it says relatives, there's a lot of jealousy. And where there's love, there's always hate. If there's no love, there's no hate. Where there's love, there's always hate. Where there's jealousy, you can bet that there's a lot of emotional attachment or emotions involved. If someone doesn't know anyone, he doesn't know the other party, obviously there's no emotions involved. It's only when you get to know someone, that's when the emotions kick in. So it's when you get to know someone, you're studying their culture, whatever it is, then the emotion start having a role. And where do we go next? We go to the story of Noah. Noah has 3 sons. What happens with the 3 sons? One of the sons